Couple things. First off, I may have miscalculated how long stuff is going to take. So make sure before I sign off today, we talk about what Thursday's schedule is going to be like. All right. So that's the first thing. Second thing, the plan for today is just to finish or to do the second part, I should say, of the System 1, System 2 stuff. So generally speaking, what we talked about last time and why I made you all, sorry, I'm just grabbing my water, why I made you all wander around a large classroom and make noise and answer strange questions was to illustrate this idea that is popular in psychology, that there's actually two different types of processes in the mind. One of them is this sort of processing that is effortful, it takes attention, you associate it with yourself, so it's like you are doing it, you're the agent, it takes time, and it follows these sorts of logical steps. So an example of this is, trying to explain to someone how to get somewhere, or trying to do a long addition or multiplication problem. And so this is the System 2 stuff, and this is what we typically think of as thinking. And then there's this idea that there's this other system, System 1, that runs automatically with no attention, and it just kind of happens in the background. It's something that happens incredibly quickly, and it's more associative in structure. So the idea is one thing gets activated, and just by the nature of your past experience, other things get activated. So as a reminder, what were some examples of things that we typically think of as System 1, or that these psychologists wanted to explain in terms of System 1? Anyone remember? And feel free to, the chat is up, so if you want to answer in the chat, feel free.
Did we say breathing?
So breathing would be something along those lines, something very low level. Other ones are these sorts of, I say peanut butter, you say what? Jelly. Something like a quick math problem where 2 + 2 equals, it automatically because you just had the experience to have it stored in your head. So this way of carving things up. Does this all sound familiar to everybody? Oh, now to go along with the baby, there's also now construction out back. So, it's just really going to be a glorious day. So this all sound familiar, right? We're good. All right. Why did we say that psychologists, I wish it was Bob the Builder. What is the reason that psychologists divide things into System 1 and System 2? I said there were two main reasons for it. Anyone remember what the main reasons why psychologists think this is or some psychologists think this is the way of thinking about the mind? There were two general ideas. One was what we illustrated in that room by wandering around and doing complex problems. And then the other had to do with explaining certain types of things. Anybody? All right, so the first reason was, well, when you were wandering around that room and I asked you the first set of questions, what's 2 + 2, what's your name, and what do you think of after peanut butter? What was that experience like? Other than weird, because I'm a weirdo. Did it seem like it took a lot of effort? Did it seem difficult?
No, it was effortless, quick and easy.
Yeah, it was quick. It was easy. The other set of problems, the ones that some of you refused to answer, the one that Eunice stopped in her tracks when I asked one of the questions, the one that other people just shouted out, no, I refuse to answer. That sort of one. What was that experience like? Did it seem like this was an easy problem? Did this seem it was something that you could just come to the answer? No. Georgia shaking. No, yeah, it was something that was effortful. So it seems like the first reason to think there are two systems is that it just seems that way when we're going about in our lives. And then the second one was that if you have System 1 and System 2 and think of them as operating in different ways, you can explain all these ways in which human beings seem irrational or unintelligent, or they make mistakes. So most of you have taken a statistics class and understand that when you roll a dice, what numbers, a fair dice, what number is the most likely to come up 1 through 6? Which is the most likely? Of any of the numbers? Come on, any of them, exactly. Any of them are equally likely. And yet when I gave you that complicated problem with the like the 66, 55, etc. versus random looking numbers on the Powerball, you all said that one of them, or a lot of you said one of them seems more likely to happen. So on the one hand, you know the rules about how statistics work, but then you made this quick automatic judgment. And the idea was that, well, this one looks non-random, so it can't be random, so therefore it's not likely. And so the idea was that certain types of mistakes that human beings often make is explained in terms of this system 1 and system 2. So this all sound mildly familiar? Are we doing all right with this stuff, those of you? Can I get some thumbs up from everyone who I can't see? Okay, thank you. I just want to make sure everyone's paying somewhat attention. All right. So that's the general background. What I want to talk about today is basically the argument from the reading, the Mandelbaum reading, which is basically arguing against this sort of picture. And the way in which he argues against it is he points to an example of something that fits all the criteria that you'd think it's system 1. And it's the sort of thing that you'd think, given how fast it is, how automatic it is, that it would have to follow the sorts of associative rules you think of with system 1. But when you actually look at how people respond to these things, it has certain processes of system 2, which suggests that the whole divide between how the mind is set up is much more complicated than this nice 2-part system. And so just a little bit of background that I want to highlight about how this argument goes and to really understand everything that we need to fully explain it out. I want to talk a little bit more about this logical versus associative bit. So what do we say two things that are associatively connected? What is it that makes them connected? So why is it that peanut butter and jelly are associated in your mind?
Because it come together.
And when specifically did they come together? When we had sandwiches, past experience. It's just things that have happened together before. And so if you want to get somebody to associate things together and form this associative connection, what do you have to do? You just have to present them with two things together over and over and over again. So if, for instance, I wanted you to really start hating cats, what could I do to you? What is one way, just associatively, I could trigger you to start hating cats?
Show you a cat and have it scratch you.
Exactly. I just show you a cat and have it scratch you. Or just as much, I could just tell you to hold a cat and then come up behind you with a really loud thing and just bang cymbals together and make it very unpleasant for you every time you hold a cat. And every time you touch a cat, I just make loud noises that make you miserable. Or every time you think about cats, I say the word cat and then I poke you with a big stick, like a sharp stick, like right in the ribs where it really hurts. Over time, just that sort of two things going together will cause you to associate one with another. This is the same reason why who's got a food they can't eat because they ate it and then threw up. I just need an example.
The baby carrots.
Yeah, we'll do baby carrots again. All right, so no, let's do pineapple. I want to do something a little different. All right, pineapples. So why is it that pineapples will make you throw up, or the thought of pineapples makes you throw up if there's somebody who it does? Well, just one time in the past, you had this very strong connection with vomiting tied in with pineapples. I actually had it one time with a TV show. I was watching a show and then got like a terrible stomach bug and I couldn't go back and finish the show because I just thought about vomiting whenever I thought about the show. And that's how I never finished. I think it was Freaks and Geeks. But that's
I love Freaks and Geeks so much.
I couldn't get through. I made it to like episode 7, and now the thought of Freaks and Geeks literally makes me feel ill inside. And it's by no fault of the shows. It's entirely this association between the writhing in pain and the show. So that's a purely associative connection. By contrast, If it's a logical sort of thing, if it's something that follows rules, attention, effort, it's something that you're trying to prove to someone, how do you get someone to accept one of these types of things? So it's not just a connection, it's rather something that someone believes or endorses as a person. What's the best way to get someone to come to, say, believe that New York City has the best food in the United States? What would you do? How would you try to imagine you've got a friend visiting, and you're trying to convince them that New York City has great food, and you can't go out. They don't want to leave to get food until you convince them that it's got good food. So what are you going to do?
Show them reviews, maybe?
You're going to show them reviews, but what else might you do? You're just going to talk to them. You're going to give them reasons. You're going to give them explanations. You're going to give them a logical argument. Or another thing, if you want to convince someone that one musical artist is better than another musical artist, and it's a belief you have, and you want them to have that belief, what are you going to do? You're going to give them reasons. You're going to give them arguments. If you want to say that Jay-Z is better than Kanye, or Kanye is better than Jay-Z, you give reasons to the person. And if they have a belief already, how do you get them to change it? So imagine you're talking to someone who believes that every person who's immigrated to the United States is a criminal. What would you do to try to convince them that that isn't the case? Would you poke them with a stick? What approach would you take?
Show the data.
Yeah, you'd show the data, you give them reasons, you talk to them about it. So system 2 sorts of things, beliefs, are sensitive to reasons. You give them arguments. By contrast, system 1, the way you get someone to make associations is you just present things to them over and over and over again. And in the same way, does anyone know how you get someone? So imagine you've got something associated together, something like peanut butter and jelly or pineapple and vomiting. How do you get someone to stop associating those things together? So for instance, the person who feels sick about pineapple, just the thought of pineapple makes you ill. If I were to, who is that, Junior, is that you? Yeah, what would I do? If I were to say, look, the pineapple isn't what caused you to feel ill. Oh, Dan. Oh, you're up there, Dan. Oh, hi. You've got a DJ in front of you. It's confusing me. So yeah, so if you've got if you're somebody who's allergic or like has eaten pineapple and feels sick. So Dan, if I'm talking to you and I go, look, it wasn't the pineapple that caused it. Look, you just need to get out of your head that it wasn't the pineapple. Let me explain to you the reasons that you actually got sick. Is that in any way going to change your level of sickness? Are you shaking your head? Okay, no. He says no. Why not? Because that's not the way you do it. If I told you that, like, look, peanut butter and jelly is a terrible sandwich type, you shouldn't associate the two together. Is that in any way going to slow down the speed with which you say jelly after I say peanut butter? No, it's just this mechanical thing that happens. So the only way to get you to stop doing it is to do what's called counter conditioning. Or extinction. So what conditioning is just to present one thing with another over and over and over again. So if instead of jelly, I wanted you to associate peanut butter and poop, I would just over and over again, like just anytime I said the word peanut butter, I would follow it up by saying poop or with a picture of poop or a story about poop. And over time, just presenting that to you over and over and over again. Now, when I say peanut butter, you'll immediately think poop. And if I now wanted you to stop thinking that, what I would do is the opposite. I'd just say peanut butter over and over again and never bring up poop. So if I were to suddenly never again mention the second part of that and talk about peanut butter and jelly and peanut butter and chocolate and peanut butter on sandwiches with marshmallows, and peanut butter on bananas, and peanut butter on apples, and just over and over and over again talked about one thing without the other, that's how you break up associative connections. It's just a matter of you present one without the other. And so the classic case of this was Pavlov's dogs. So remember we were talking about Pavlov's, I think we talked about, did we talk about the dogs last class or the class before? So everyone remember the Pavlov dog experiment? Basically, Russian scientist dings a bell, then brings some dogs food, then dings a bell, then brings some dogs food. And after a while, the simple dinging of the bell causes the dogs to salivate because they're expecting the food. Well, if you now want to stop the dogs from salivating, you want it so that a bell no longer causes them to salivate. What do you end up doing? What do you change?
You ring the bell and start doing something else.
Exactly. All you have to do, ring the bell, never give them food. And after a few trials, they're going to stop salivating. It's just the way an associative connection works.
Did anyone read Hunger Games? You know, the third book with PETA? No one read Hunger Games. Never mind.
If anyone wants to jump in, I got 20 pages in the book too, and I was just like, oh, they're going back in. I'm bored. I don't want the same thing a second time. So I cannot contribute to this one, Kai. But if anyone else wants to jump in, feel free.
Oh, never mind.
But yeah, that's the idea with associations. You bring them about by just presenting two things together, and once you have the association, you break them apart by presenting one without the other. That's the idea with associations. By contrast, in argument, you need to give reasons for it, and just mere association isn't going to convince someone of some sort of belief. So, for instance, if I just say, I'm trying to think, what is one? What's a food that one of you hates and the rest of you can pretend you hate for the point of an example?
Durians. Most people hate durians. Most people haven't tried it though yet.
What are durians?
It's the big spiky fruit that tastes like, to a lot of people, like sweaty socks.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so we'll say durians. So imagine that you, or I guess if you want another one, pineapple on pizza, that's a good argument one. But let's go with durians because I've never gotten to talk about those in class. And every semester somebody brings up pineapples on pizza. So for those of you who have had it, raise your hand if you've had it and thought it was disgusting. If I were to just over and over again tell you, durian's delicious, durian's delicious, durian's delicious, is it going to change your views on it? Or if I tried to convince you that, like, say there's a certain politician who you hate, and you have many reasons for hating this person, and I just said this person's name and love over and over again, is that going to change your views on them? No, it's not. Because that is a belief you have that only is responsible to reasons. So if I want to, so imagine there's a certain person you used to really hate, and then I start telling you good things about them, that might change your views. But simply saying the person's name and or the person's name and then giving you a pat on the head isn't going to make your views or beliefs about how good this person is change. So this final key difference between things that are belief-like, things that have this structure of an actual, you believe it at a person level, you endorse it, is it responds to logical reasons and argument. By contrast, something that's associative, you get rid of it with counter conditioning. You get rid of it by, what extinction is you just don't engage this thing at all for a very long time. So for instance, if you don't encounter carrots at all for years, then over time you'll just be less likely to have that response of carrots than illness. Does that make sense to everybody? What this distinction is of this is responsible to reasons, this is not. So we're all on board, just generally speaking. All right.
Question, sorry.
Wait, what's
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Steph.
So I was gonna say, so like, you know, a lot of people have associations, like if you binge drink and get alcohol poisoning from something, you know, people say like in 7 years you can get over it. Like you won't have the same like physical response. So like, how does that, what that
So
relationship
that's
with system was.
extinction. That right there is an excellent example of extinction. So yeah, those of you, I'm sure either you or someone you know, you've got the friend who can never drink tequila again. I feel like many people have this friend because they drank too much tequila and now they can never drink it again. But if you wait 7 years, then what happens is that association just breaks down, because over time, it's just like a mechanical connection that isn't getting activated. But if this person kept drinking tequila and kept feeling ill, then over time it would stay just as strong, if not even go stronger. Yeah, and I know there were some people early on in COVID when they started making like the hand sanitizer at the old like factories. So basically, when COVID hit, a lot of places that made things like cheap vodka and cheap tequila started churning out hand sanitizer instead. And so that hand sanitizer just smelled like booze. And so people who had an aversion to bad booze early on were just feeling grossed out by this hand sanitizer because it just smelled like you were putting tequila on your hands, because kind of you were. It was just like slightly different tequila. So yes, that right there. But if you didn't smell it for a very, very long time, it would just generally break down and just go away as other connections in your brain got stronger. So that's a really good case of extinction. All right, so that's the general background. And what we're going to talk about now is the Mandelbaum reading, and talking about how what he basically does is he comes up with a counterexample in which what he shows is, here is a phenomenon which everyone who's a dual process theorist is going to say is going to have to be system one, because it is automatic, it's fast, it's not something that you identify with, it just kind of happens in the background. And yet it seems to follow a logical structure and is responsive to arguments. And so the idea is, look, the dual process view says all these things go together because that's how the mind is structured. But his argument is they don't go together. Rather, what's going on in this case is there are these unconscious beliefs, and we need a completely different understanding of how the mind is organized in this very straightforward system one, system two way. And so what his example is that he talks about as the counterexample, or as the case study, is, you put it up here, implicit bias. So, how many of you have heard of implicit bias? Raise them up or thumb them up or whatever. So anyone want to try to give a definition either in the chat or out loud while I drink some water?
Like the concept of like internalized racism and internalized sexism and things like that, where social conditioning, you're not consciously aware that you have these biases.
Yeah, so the idea is, with implicit bias, it's something where you behave in a way that suggests or treats different groups of people differently. But if you ask the person consciously, how do you feel about members of this group? They will say, I value everyone equally. I'm not racist against this group. So there have been various tests that have been done on the nature of implicit bias and just the way in which this is brought out. And what's the opposite of implicit bias, or I guess the other type, is explicit bias. So what's a case of explicit bias? Well, a case in which someone actively says, I hate people who are of this race, or I hate people who are of this gender. That's explicit bias. Implicit bias is when you treat members of one race worse or respond to them differently, but not consciously realizing you're doing so. So a classic case of implicit bias is the person who says, look, I value everyone equally, but when they're crossing a street at night, if they see a person of color, they'll move to the other side of the road. But if they see a white person, they'll stay on the same side. But they don't consciously realize they're doing it because that person's Black. It's just how it happens. And another one is they've done tests where basically you see how close someone sits to somebody else of a different race. So you see if somebody is, you'll be like, how much do you value people of other races? They'll say, I value everyone equally. But you'll find that if you ask them to go and pick a random chair in a room, they'll more likely choose to sit next to certain races of people or put their chair closer to people of a race. That's a bias towards those sorts of things. And then the most classic experiment of this type to study implicit bias is what's like, I don't remember the name of it, but it's basically the cell phone gun test. Are people familiar with this study? Anyone? I'll describe it, but I'm just curious how many.
Yeah, we were actually talking about it a couple weeks ago in my Black Studies class.
Yeah, so what the basic study is you are presented with a photo and it's a split second. It's just like flashes on the screen. So it flashes on the screen, and what ends up happening is you in a split second have to identify whether the thing the person is holding is a gun or a cell phone. And you just, if it's a gun, you press one key. If it's a cell phone, you press another key. And so you just, as quickly as possible, on the basis of this flash, say gun or cell phone, gun or cell phone. Now, the way the study works, what they change is the race of the person depicted in the photo. And what they find is just about everybody, no matter how explicitly racist they are, no matter what their own race is more likely to make mistakes in the following way. They're more likely to mistakenly identify a white person as holding a cell phone when they're actually holding a gun, and more likely to identify a black person as holding a gun when they're actually holding a cell phone. And this is something where it applies pretty universally to just about everybody who takes the test, which is kind of this terrifying finding. Like all of us have this thing in which we recognize these things more quickly one way or another. There's another version of it that's been done with children, where you basically show children pictures that could be framed in either way. So what you do is you have a photo of one child handing something, like you have two children who are just standing there, and they both have their hands on something. And the idea is, you ask the child, is this photo one in which the child is handing or giving a gift to the other one? Or is it a case in which the second child is stealing from the first child? And what they've found is, again, the children have different views on it based on race. If one of the children is black, they are more likely to say that person is stealing the present, the toy from the other kid. While if they're both white, they're more likely to say one kid is giving it to another kid. And so if you ask these kids, like, what do you feel about race? They're like 5 years old and they don't have sophisticated views of like white supremacy. And yet on some implicit level, it seems like they are racist about this sort of thing. So everyone on board with what implicit racism is generally? And I'm sure many of you have heard this before. I just wanted to review it. So
Sorry, one thing.
yeah, Sam, fire away.
I know I missed some classes last week, so I don't know if this was already like shared. Like, did you share like the project implicit or anything like that?
Say that again.
Have you shared project implicit in the class?
I have not.
Okay. It's
So
just,
if you would like to share it, that would actually be awesome. If you
Okay.
wanted to just like send it around.
it's very,
Yeah. But no, last time was much more just the mechanics of the system 1 and system 2. So yeah, this is basically, you can take the test and find out how implicitly biased you truly are. And Sab just put in the chat if you want to see it or take it for later. And so let's now combine this implicit bias stuff with system 1 and system 2. According to somebody who believes system 1 and system 2, how are they going to explain explicit bias? A case in which someone is racist, knows they're racist, and says things like people of that race are worse than people of that race. Versus a case of implicit bias where someone doesn't say that they are racist, doesn't say that people are different, and yet responds in these ways that suggest, no, you do have this implicit bias. So how would they explain this in terms of these systems? This is just like a combine the two. I'm
You mean
opening
like
up.
the association
like the association of like media, how media, what's the word? Shows these people in media and the associations we make from it.
Yeah, and so which of these does that explain?
Oh, implicit bias.
Yeah, so implicit bias. So system one's people, system one, system two, dual system process people are going to say, look, this is a phenomenon that is easily explained by system one versus system two. The people who have explicit bias, their system two is racist. They have this ability to, or they have something that they consciously endorse that says people of one race are better than another. Those of us who are implicitly biased are rather people who respond in this case. It's just that because of the media, because of the news, because of everything else, we have built these associations between people of color and bad things, and it is not rational. And that's why we aren't conscious of it. This is why it just automatically happens. So does that make sense to everyone? How this seems like a perfect thing for system one versus system two to look to explain. You've got a behavior that's implicit and looks very system one-y, a separate one that looks very system two-y, and you can explain why somebody who doesn't explicitly say, I'm racist, this group is better than this one, still shows this implicit bias. So does everyone understand just the general picture of how this nicely lines up? Now, here's where the big argument comes in. And what we're going to do for the rest of class is just talk about basically what Mandelbaum does is say, all right, this is a lovely picture that many people have assumed, but there's a problem. And the problem is implicit bias does not behave like something that's associative. Rather, when you actually look at implicit bias studies, it actually seems to follow logical rules, which is suggesting that what's going on is that people who are implicitly biased, it's not that they have these bare associations, it's rather that they actually have the belief people of color are worse or dangerous. They just don't know they have this belief. And so they actually, if you look at it, it follows this sort of endorsing sort of idea. And so what he does is he goes through a few different studies from social psychology that are meant to illustrate that implicit bias follows these logical rules and so shouldn't be thought of as associative. So everyone on board with just generally how he structures this argument. And so just to give an example of what we're going to do is talk about the three studies or three of the studies that he talks to. So Dan just asked me a really good question, which I want to bring up out loud before we get into this. So as a real world thing, how can this be seen in relation to the subway attack this morning? So as a sort of thing with, so I've not been following the subway attack in the last couple hours. So I don't know what they found out about the suspect. I don't know about what the type of targeting was. So if anyone has anything that has come out in the past couple hours while I was prepping to just fill in the story, feel free. So there's a physical description. Do we know at all what the cause of the attack was or anything like that? So 5 foot 5 inch black man, 175 to 200 pounds in a green construction vest. Do we know what the motivation or anything else was at this point? So what I would say in this sort of case is there's a couple different ways you could frame this. And what you would find is, so we've got a race of someone and a event that happened. Those things, if racism is an associative system, we would simply expect for the fact that these two things have gone together, the race of the suspect and the shooting, to change people's views in this very associative way. If, however, it's a system two belief sort of thing, then what you're thinking is, you might not realize it, but if this changes your views about people of color, then the reasoning would be that what's going on is you are having a line of thought like this. This person who did this was Black. Therefore, Black people are more likely to do these sorts of things. Therefore, I need, so that's the difference here. That's how they would explain a change in people's views. And so this does have practical implications because how much your views change or what you need to do to counteract this is going to change. So if you say this, so imagine that a bunch of people after hearing this story now have more negative views about people of color, like all people of color completely unfairly. I'll get to you in 1 second, Kai. Well, how do you want them to stop doing that? How do you get them to stop essentializing an entire group of people on one person's bad behavior? Well, it's going to depend on whether you think that it is something that follows associative connections or something that follows logical rules. If it's something that follows logical rules, you need to give them reasons why the fact that one person of a certain race did something means you shouldn't draw conclusions about the whole race. If, by contrast, it's associative, the way you get someone to not respond to this in a biased way is you just show them cases of people of color not being violent over and over again. And it's just like present. So that's the practical thing of when you know, like, so I can't explain the actual cause of the violence, but the response that might happen in certain circles to draw grand claims about people of color on the behavior of one person, like one person's bad behavior, that's the sort of thing that the understanding of is this logical or is this associative has very practical consequences for. All right, Kai.
I was just wondering what the place of confirmation bias would make in that, because I feel like implicit bias in terms of that could just transcend it into explicit bias or convert it into explicit bias. Does that make sense? Sorry, my brain is kind of half there.
No, it's okay. Mine is too.
The implicit bias that you have, and then when this attack happens, it ends up bringing it to the conscience, but it's confirmation bias. So then it turns your implicit bias into explicit bias.
So I think both somebody who accepts this picture and somebody like Mandelbaum, who's going to say that these are both actually logical sorts of things, and they're actually rather a lot of the unconscious automatic stuff is really logical agency belief type things. I think they'd both be able to explain this, but they give very different accounts of why this confirmation bias would be going on. So if you're a system 1, system 2 person, what you'd say is because you've already got these associations underlying it, this will make you more likely upon encountering this sort of case to now create a new explicit belief. Well, the other sort of account is what's going on is you already have that implicit belief, which biases you. And what happens when you encounter this sort of confirmation is it brings something that was already in existence unconsciously to the conscious level. So it's going to be two slightly different explanations of the same sort of phenomenon. But I think you're right that that is one thing that we're going to want to explain is why does it seem like people who are already somewhat racist are going to be more likely to draw this conclusion explicitly, like you can't trust people of XYZ because of the behavior of one person. All right, so I want to go through the experiments now that that Eric talks about to discuss the reasons that he thinks that actually some of the things that are implicit bias are actually cases in which these are implicit, underlying, genuine person level beliefs, not just some associative connections. So one thing to say about associative connections is you can only make them stronger. If you associate two negative things together, you can't, all they can do is make it more negative because that's the nature of these associative connections. They're just mechanical things. So if I give you one experience in which you vomit and another experience in which you feel sick, but don't quite vomit around the same thing, it's just going to get more and more and more negative, right? So if the first time you have carrots, you throw up, the second time you feel ill, but don't throw up, the third time you're going to even more strongly dislike carrots. There's no way for those two things to cancel each other out. However, there are other cases in which it seems like negatives do cancel each other out. And this is the famous enemy of your enemy is your friend. So, who's somebody you hate? Just somebody give me an example of someone they dislike strongly.
An old coworker of mine.
Okay, so imagine, so Kai that has a coworker, they very much dislike, she very much dislikes. Now imagine that she finds out that actually I know this coworker and I hate them too. Like we know each other from something else. How are you gonna feel about me now?
I like you so much more. I already
Exactly.
like you. I like you
It's
so
gonna
much.
go up even more. It's not that we're negative. And so it's not like the sort of case in which I have a negative feeling, you have a negative feeling, so therefore it goes like, and now you just hate me even more because your association, your negative association with that person and negative association with me goes together, and therefore you're even more negative. No, it's that they somehow cancel each other out because you think, I hate this person, they hate this person, that's something we have in common, and that's improving my views. And so, or another one, Hitler. If you find out that I also hate Hitler, that's going to make you feel a little bit better about me if I have equally strong views to you.
I'll say if you hate Hitler, honestly, you're still neutral to me. I feel like that's a pretty universal.
Yeah, I feel like that one is one where we kind of assume everyone likes Hitler. But does everyone see this is a complex logical reasoning? This is a complex logical sort of thing. It's not just pure associative connections. So Sab asked, is this kind of related to the halo effect? Yes and no. So the halo effect is the tendency for us to like more positive, like things that are pretty or things that are nice are cases in which we generally like whatever that thing is saying. And actually, I think, Sab, that the halo effect in some ways lends itself more to an associative explanation. So if in a commercial, they're selling really cheap beer, but the person selling it is very attractive. Well, the idea is supposed to be that the fact that you associate the positive feeling of the attraction of this person with this crappy beer improves the views of the crappy beer. So that's a purely associative account. By contrast, in this sort of case, it's rather that it's not that you're going from positive with something to another positive. It's rather that you're going from a negative plus a negative to a positive, which is something that only seems to be able to be explained logically. Sab, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I mean, like, I guess it kind of just depends maybe on like your view of like positivity and negativity. Like, for instance, like if I view veganism as a very positive thing, and I meet somebody else who has that like same mindset, I may think more generally like positive about them as a whole. However, somebody who's like not into veganism or thinks that there's like fundamental issues with veganism, it kind of comes into subjectivity. You know what I'm saying? Like, so that's why
I think you're like. So I think you're spot on that maybe some cases of halo effect might be better explained in this way. And that's an excellent point. I didn't really think of that case you were just talking about. But I think that you can really show the clearer case, because the thing is, if you have a case in which you find out someone feels something positive and you also feel it's positive, and then it goes up even more, that's a case that either can be explained logically or can be explained associatively. You had two positives and now there's a stronger positive. You had a positive, you reasoned somebody else had a positive, together they make you like the person more. The only case that really differentiates between the two, though, is going to be a case in which you dislike someone, you find out someone else dislikes them, so you like this other person more. That's really hard to explain on the associative picture. Kai, you just had a hand.
Oh, never mind. It's okay.
Okay, Sab.
Oh, yeah. So, all right. So I can't help but like think of like, I know we were like talking about mental illnesses early in the class, but like, there's like a lot of data that shows like people who have schizophrenia, and not like schizoaffective, but like hallucinatory, like schizophrenia, they like operate like on a system 2. Like there's logic to delusion, right?
Yeah.
So I'm just kind of curious, like how does that look? Like, how do you break that?
So that is an amazing question. And so first off, I don't know, generally speaking, how like the treatment would go or why this sort of thing is like how you would actually do it in practice to break it. However, one thing I can say is that that sort of case might be the sort of case that lends itself to an explanation of there being these unconscious complex sorts of processing, because it seems like one thing that you cannot do in a lot of these cases where you'd be like, well, if this is just like an underlying random sort of association, you could just counter condition a schizophrenic away from their feelings or their delusions. When in truth, it looks like you have to somehow get through in a reasoned-based way, or at the very least, associations like counter conditioning isn't going to make this go away. And so that might be a case. I'm not an expert on schizophrenia and the treatment of it, but my tendency would be to say that's actually a good case for thinking that some parts of system 2 are some of the characteristics of system 2, namely logical, the sorts of coherent stories that get built in delusion, even though it's not an agential person level seeming sort of thing, would suggest that this way of carving it up is not an ideal way of doing it. And I'd have to think more about it, but my guess would be the fact that there are mental illnesses like that is a separate counterexample from the one Eric's giving, but also shows that this way of carving things up might not be the best. Was that responsive? I want to make sure I'm responding successfully.
Yeah, no, that was great. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. All right, so now let's talk about what the actual experiment is. So if implicit bias is indeed associative, then what we should expect is cases in which thank you, Dan. Let me actually make sure I'm characterizing this experiment correctly. So yeah, so the way this experiment worked is basically you started off by creating associations between someone you didn't know. Like it was a picture, and then you just associated with that picture a bunch of negative things very quickly. So you just like so it's an experimental setting. Someone looks at this person, learns a bunch of negative things about them. The next step then is you find out somebody else has a negative feeling about this first person you just met in the experimental setting. And then what you do is you test very quickly whether somebody is more likely to associate this second person with negative things or positive things. So what you basically do is you give them a timed test in which you ask them, you like present the one person and then give them negative or positive things alongside of them and see which one they're faster to respond to. So if you give a picture of the second person and they're faster to respond to negative stuff, that suggests that you've made a negative association between the first person and your negative feelings about them, these other negative things coming in with the second person, and now you've got this associative, automatic, fast judgment about the second person. If, however, even though you're not thinking through this consciously, it's just some presentation, if by contrast, you're faster to associate this second person with positive stuff, that suggests unconsciously you've gone through this enemy of my enemy is my friend reasoning. And even though it's unconscious, it's fast, you have gone through some complex underlying processes. And what the experiment found is indeed, people are faster to associate the second person with positive stuff, which is suggesting that this sort of thing is somehow, even though we don't realize it's going on, we're doing these sorts of enemy of my enemy is my friend reasoning. Does that make sense to everybody? So that's the first experiment that Eric talks about. The second one is as follows. If a connection is associative and you present an argument about it, it shouldn't make any difference whatsoever, whether the argument is good or bad. Why? Because all associations are connections and the number of connections. So if I give you a really, really good argument for why Michael Jordan is the greatest basketball player ever, versus I give you a really, really terrible argument about whether Michael Jordan is the best basketball player ever. That will affect your beliefs. But if it's the case where you feel ill from pineapple, then if I give you a really good, logically structured argument for why you shouldn't feel ill versus one that's got very poor logical reasoning, it's invalid, it's really crappy, neither one is going to make a difference for the pineapple case because that's a pure associative connection. The quality of your reasoning isn't going to make a difference. So this second experiment, what they did is they basically presented people with, at first you do an implicit attitude test. Then what you do is you read an article about the quality, or the actual article was something about whether universities should hire more Black professors or not. Half the subjects were given a well-structured argument. The other half were given a crappily structured argument. Now, according to a system 1, system 2 person, if this is associative, it shouldn't matter which of the two arguments you give a person because neither one is going to make a difference. And yet what they found was the people who were given the higher quality arguments, even though they were now taking an implicit bias test, showed less bias after the quality argument compared to the bad argument. And that's suggesting that this, whatever is driving our implicit biases, is somehow sensitive to argument quality, which suggests that it's not purely associative. It's this logical, actually, an implicitly racist person has this sort of belief. They just don't know they do. So does that make sense to everyone? Kai.
Well, even beyond arguments, I feel like, these experiments that bring implicit bias to light and make people aware of it, then if they're aware of it, then they can choose whether to work on it themselves as well without any logical reasoning because they already logically know that this is wrong.
So I think that's 100% right. But just to give the system 1, system 2 people their due, I think they could give an explanation of that, which is what you're doing. So if you say that implicit bias really is associative, which I, following Eric, do not because of all this evidence, I think if you think it is associative, what you can say is you have brought to someone's awareness that they have these associative connections. And in so doing, you cause them to form a new belief, namely, I'm implicitly racist and I should stop doing that. So you can still explain their motivation, just it takes another couple steps. All right. Then here was the last one. So if you've got associations, it shouldn't, like, other people's views should not matter to you. So for instance, if I told you, hey, Dan, when I eat pineapple, I don't feel sick. When I eat pineapple on pizza, I'm not grossed out. Does that in any way change your views? Or anybody else can answer as well. Yeah, Dan says, good for me, don't feed it to me. Also, imagine if so take the case of, imagine you hate the food item. And I tell you, well, the rest of the class doesn't think it's disgusting. Is that in any way going to change your views? Like, something that really makes you feel ill. If I tell you everyone else loves it, is that actually going to make you feel any less ill? No, it's not going to change anything. You might be like, well, I guess I'm just an outlier. By contrast, if I tell you, so Sab, go ahead.
Oh no, I was gonna say, like, so, and that's only because it has like like a physiological response, right? And and not just, yeah.
And the idea is supposed to be, it's just a bare associative connection where what's making you feel ill is not reason-based. It's this association between the physiological response and the food item. And that's not subject to reasoning. That's just something that happens.
Can you have like that same sort of association, like beyond perceptual modalities? Like, can you just have that like in the mind or whatever?
So I think you probably could have, you could have things beyond the perceptual. What you could do is you could have something like, if over and over again, like if I just presented to you like stories about the Roman Empire immediately after watching basketball, neither of those are physiological, but I could get you through some strange connection forming to now associate the Roman Empire and NBA basketball, even though they don't have any, neither of them is directly physiological, and neither of them is perceptual, and yet they could be associated together in this way. It's just, as a matter of fact, the perceptual cases are generally the ones that we are more aware of because they have that very strong physiological element to it. So, however, if I were to tell, so going back, it looks like other people's views, you're welcome, don't matter for associative things. By contrast, it does seem like if everyone else believes something, you might shift your views about it. So for instance, if I told you it's going to rain tomorrow, and everybody else in the class tells you it's going to rain tomorrow, then you're going to be a little more likely to believe it's going to rain tomorrow. However, so back to the implicit bias thing, if an implicit bias is associative, then finding out that you are in the minority or majority with your implicit bias should in no way affect whether you have that bias. So for instance, if it really is associative and I just have like this bare level connection between, say, a person of a certain color and a negative feeling, then learning that other people don't have that connection is in no way going to affect my implicit bias because it's just a connection. If, however, it's something logical and there really is this belief of like people of color are bad, and then you tell me I'm very much in the minority, then I might start to behave slightly differently in these implicit bias cases. And so again, it's supposed to be a case of dual process theory expects one thing, namely that learning about my peers' views is going to make no difference. By contrast, this if you believe that it's unconscious beliefs, like full person level things that you just aren't aware of, then you'd expect that implicit bias can be affected by learning what other people's views are. And indeed, it looks like this is what happened. So the way they did this test is they first brought a bunch of people into a room and they asked them to do an implicit bias test. And then they split the people up into those who scored quite implicitly biased and quite unimplicit, or I guess quite implicitly unbiased. There were the highly biased ones and the not highly biased ones. And then what they did is they told these people either, you know, your views are very similar to everybody else's, or they told them, wow, you're very much the outlier. Most people aren't nearly as implicitly biased as you are. And then what they did is say, now we're going to ask you to go sit in the waiting room for a minute while we like collect our experimental stuff. And you can, here's a chair, there's not enough in the room, you can put your chair wherever you want. And what they found is the people who were told that either if you were not very implicitly biased and you were told you were in the majority, you became more likely to sit near a random person of color in the room. Like literally you put your chair closer. Implicit bias, you were more comfortable in being near this person. Simply because you were told that you were not implicitly biased and also you were in the majority. They also found, though, if you were somebody who had a high implicit bias score and then were told you're in the minority, most people are not implicitly biased like you, versus someone who was highly implicitly biased and told, look, you're in the majority, everyone's just as implicitly biased as you are. What they found was if you were told you were in the majority, that everyone's implicitly biased, you on average sat further away from the person of color who was sitting in the room already, who was like a Confederate. They were there as like the actual test was how close would, so basically, if you were found to have a high implicit bias against people of color, and you were told that is very common, how close will you sit to a person of color in a room with not knowing that this is the study? Versus if you're told you are implicitly biased and you're in the minority, very few people are implicitly biased like you, then how close do those people sit? And what they found was that you sit closer to someone if you think other people do not have implicit biased views. So does everyone understand how that argument works? It's a little more complicated, but the basic idea is, look, if it's associative, it shouldn't matter whether anyone else believes that people of color or has implicit bias about people of color. It shouldn't matter because your implicit bias is associative and isn't going to respond to reasons. If, however, your associative bias does respond, or your implicit bias does respond to how other people behaved, then that's suggesting that what's causing that is somehow a logical sort of thing. So does that make sense to everybody, how that sort of argument goes? So this, I mean, I think this is just an ingenious way of reasoning about this, and it is one with very much practical consequences. So a lot of the things we're talking about, like how is the mind set up? Well, you might think this is a completely arbitrary sort of concern that we shouldn't really be worried about system 1 versus system 2. It's not something we should care about. But this is something with practical implications, because implicit bias, I mean, the majority of people, and I know just about all New Yorkers that I've interacted with in class or most other cases, think implicit bias is a bad thing. We do not want people of color being treated differently, either consciously or unconsciously. That is something we want to have stop. Well, how would we get people to stop doing that? Well, the psychology matters for how we do that. If this is associative, we have to counter condition away. We have to just present people over and over again the group that is biased against and unbiased cases. If, however, it is not associative, it is logical, then the correct way to get implicit bias to go away is to make people aware that they have these biases and give them reasons not to have the biases. Give them arguments, even if they don't realize that they have this unconscious belief. The way to get them to change is to point out, hey, this is something that happens. This is why it's bad. These are the sorts of consequences it has. And so this is something that has, like, this is one of the cases in which thoughts about how the mind is set up really do have practical real world implications. If you think it's associative, then the solution is just to have more instances in which these things are correlated together or associated together. If it's this, you have to take a completely different approach. You can't just over and over again show examples of people who go against the stereotype. That's not going to work. So does everyone understand, like, why this? So what, just to paint the picture, thanks, Dan. The picture is, we talked last time about this very interesting view on how the mind is structured, and it seems to explain a lot of things. However, on the flip side, it seems to get a lot of stuff around implicit bias and explicit bias wrong. So what's the payoff? Well, the payoff is the mind is even more complicated than we typically assume. It looks not just that there's unconscious associations, but there are unconscious beliefs. There's unconscious reasoning. You actually do complex thoughts without even consciously knowing you're doing it. Which brings us back to the free will class that we talked about a couple times ago. This kind of ties in with the same sort of idea that there's a whole lot going on under the surface and that's causing you to do certain sorts of things. That's all I wanted to say on this topic. Is everyone on board with all of this? Are there any questions, comments, concerns, feelings? Anything at all on this? All right, awesome. So here's this interesting situation we're in. The interesting situation is I thought this stuff was going to take 3 classes to do, and it took 2 classes to do. So we now have this weird thing in which we have this class before spring break with no material for it. Now there's 2 options here, and I think I know what your choice is going to be. These 2 options are going to be as follows. Either we can come up with a brand new class topic, which will probably carry over to after spring break, and we'll have this weird thing with a break in the middle, or we can just take Thursday off, and what we can do is cover, what I will do is I would feel bad. So every semester there's somebody who wants to get their money's worth. And it's like, I don't want any classes canceled. And so what I would do, as of right now, the last class of the semester is due to just be, we talk about like, here's the papers, goodbye. And there's nothing scheduled. So what I would do instead is cancel Thursday's class. We just wouldn't meet this upcoming Thursday. And instead, what I will do is make an optional class on the last day of the semester in which we can talk about some topic for those of you who want to get your money's worth and would feel let down by not having a full class period. So how many of you, and Sab, yes, I see, I will stick around. What are people's thoughts on this? If I canceled class on Thursday and substituted it with a replacement optional class or optional topic on the last day of the semester, is there anyone who's going to be heartbroken with this idea? Or are people okay just canceling class the Thursday before spring break? Everyone's okay with this? Can I get thumbs up or, all right, awesome. All right, so I will email everyone. And basically what this means is we are not going to meet on Thursday. You're free to stay home. And what I will do is, for those of you who want to cover something like elephants or animal stuff, I will stay behind on the last day of class. And we will just basically, for anyone who wants to talk about smart animals, we can talk about that. Also, votes are in on what we'll be studying. And the winning vote was dreams. And the second winning vote was, what was second? Humor. So I'm going to find readings on those two topics and send them out to everybody over the next few days. But so after spring break, we are first going to cover, give me 1 second, Nuzat. So we're first going to cover Worfianism, and I'll talk more about that. Then we're going to talk about humor, and then we'll talk about dreams. And then if we have a little more time or something, we'll stick on something else. So yeah, I'm not sure it's going to be full philosophy of comedy, but it is going to be basically, so the literature on this is basically like, why on earth do we find things funny? Like, this is a psychological state. What is it doing for us? Like, you know, fear has a purpose. Fear's purpose is to keep you safe. What's the purpose of humor? Why is this a psychological state, and what does it consist in? Is it that you're just, so there's one view of it's just a way of increasing your own self-esteem by putting yourself above other people. And that's one theory. And there's a different theory in which what it is it's a response to a case which you're primed for danger, and then it's not actually dangerous. So it's a release of energy. So we'll talk about what the different possible views are. All right, any more questions, comments, concerns? For people who want to talk to me for a minute, I will stick around, but I just want to make sure that we have no more questions. Class on Thursday is canceled. Nuza.
Hi, Professor.
Hi.
I know I accessed last week too,
Okay.
but you were supposed to put a new discussion and it's still not there. So does that mean it's canceled for this week again?
Yes, yes, it does. You guys are, let me just tell you, you are killing the game in the discussion board for the last 2 weeks. All of you, 100%, your answers are perfect. Yes, I have had, my week has been madness, and I just completely forgot about it. So yes, you're all just like boosting your discussion board questions. I'm not gonna punish you for my incompetence. Any other questions, comments, concerns? All right. Everyone, I'm going to stop the recording. You are free to go. I'm not going to see, I will email you all, but I'm not going to see you before spring break. Have a great spring break. I hope you're all able to relax. If you're taking the subway home later, be safe, be aware. If you are staying home and you're still home right now, be safe. I hope you have a good night. And if you want to talk to me at all about anything class related, subway shooting related, anything, just shoot me an email. All right, have a great rest of your evening. Have a great rest of your week. Have a great spring break. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.